Onward and upward, children, here we go. This is the second time I have to do this because I have terribly inconsiderate neighbors and I'm going to lose my mind. So, hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Sarah. Let's talk about the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg trials occurred after World War II in 1945 through 1946. There were 12 men who were brought to trial because of their high-ranking roles in the atrocities that had happened during, that period of time. They were high-ranking military people. There were people who were involved in governmental positions. There were certain educational positions even, and in particular, there was one trial that was for doctors who performed atrocities. That was called the doctor's trial. The doctor's trial was important because it brought to light a lot of what had been happening behind closed doors, or even out in the open maybe, in concentration camps all over Nazi-occupied areas where experiments were being done on people, where medical procedures were being done to human beings that may not have been necessary, may not have been wanted, may not have even had a purpose. So the doctor's trial was able to put out into the open at least many of the things that had gone on, and it was horrifying. One of the things that was stated during the doctor's trial was that there were no laws against what was done during the experimentation that was done in the concentration camps by the Nazis. They said that it wasn't unlawful because there were no laws against it, so, they couldn't be brought to trial for it. Now, to a more modern mind, even to simply a more ethical mind, it might be obvious that you shouldn't do things that are horrific to human beings, but I guess technically they were correct. I wouldn't necessarily say that it was correct, but technically I guess what they said was correct. There were no laws against it because there was a surrounding morality. For example, the Hippocratic Oath, which in theory most doctors would take. We look back on it and we're like, obviously these were terrible things. And I think at the time any reasonable person would have said, yes, obviously these are terrible things, but we already looked at the clinical trial process and the history of that, and we looked at thalidomide and we saw what could happen when things are not very well defined, which sometimes they aren't, sometimes they had not been. Well, anyway, 12 men were brought to trial and 12 men were sentenced to death on an international court from a variety of the Allied powers from World War II. And these 12 men were ultimately either killed or I think one of them did it himself. But they no longer exist shortly after the trials. It might seem that that was not nearly enough, but there is something to a symbolic cutting off at the head of the people who were the head, you know what I mean? One of the things that was derived from the Nuremberg trial, and specifically from the doctor's trial, was that we had an idea of the sort of things that maybe needed to be defined, maybe needed to be better defined, so that we would have something that you could look at and say, oh, this is something I shouldn't do, even if it may or may not be obvious, it is stated. In the years following the trial, the declarations of the Nuremberg Code were developed based on a number of things that had been brought up during the trials and that were found out about what had happened. Ultimately, there are 10 declarations of the Nuremberg Code, which are, roughly speaking, statements of what you should do as somebody who is involved in an experiment and who is doing an experiment on human beings. We would see this be brought into use later on, as we talked about earlier, in the development of the clinical trial process, among other things. It's now very heavily worked into the way that we work in medicine. But let's hear what the declarations are so that we know what we're looking at here. Like I said, there are 10 declarations, but I'm going to sort of do them out of order because, well, the way that it's written, Declaration 1 is incredibly important, and everything else sort of derives from Declaration 1, but because of how important it is, I think I'm going to put it at the end. Also, there are certain things that seem more obvious and cut and dry, which I've put towards the top of the list, and things that are maybe less cut and dry, so those are a little bit further towards the bottom. But we're going to start off with Declaration 7. Declaration 7 states that Proper preparations should be made and adequate facilities provided to protect the experimental subject against even remote possibilities of injury, disability, or death. And Declaration 8 is of a similar mindset, so we'll do them together. Declaration 8 states that the experiment should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. The highest degree of skill and care should be required through all stages of the experiment of those who conduct or engage in the experiment. What you need to do, according to these declarations, is be sure that your experimental process is not going to put your experimental subject into any serious harm because of their participation. And, as it states in Declaration 8, you need to be sure that you, as the experimenter, and like we said in the clinical trial process, anybody who is involved in this experimental process is actually qualified to be involved in the experimental process. If you're talking about World War II, you're talking about dingy, dungeon-esque laboratories where experiments were performed, which didn't need to be done, and there was often very little care given to any part of the process of the experiment. And in addition to that, there were very frequently unqualified, untrained people who were doing these experiments. So in a modern sense, it may not seem like this is something that we need to be worried about, possibly because it has become so ingrained in our modern way of doing things. However, I don't know, it feels like sometimes these things get a little lax because they are so well ingrained. So, sometimes you have to wonder if the pharmacy tech at a pharmacy is perfectly qualified to participate in some sort of experimental trial or some sort of process that, for whatever reason, is being done through this pharmacy. I'm not saying that a pharmacy tech isn't very good at being a pharmacy tech and counting pills or helping out the pharmacist, but, I'm sure they're not trained as a scientist or somebody who's necessarily going to be able to do an experiment as well as somebody who is a scientist or a laboratory tech or something to that effect. Different fields, different knowledge. One is not the other, you know what I mean? I don't know. Sometimes these things come up. I don't know if they necessarily seem like they should, but maybe there are things that we need to reevaluate in a more modern sensibility. Declaration 4 states that the experiment should be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. Declaration 5 similarly states that no experiment should be so conducted where there is an a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except perhaps in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. Well, that's interesting. So what you're looking at with Declaration 4 is that you, while doing the experiment, need to ensure that the experiment will not cause any harm while it's being performed. And Declaration 5 is stating that if you have a reason to believe beforehand that there is going to be some reason that these things are going to become a problem, that you need to not do that, or you need to rework your experiment, or something needs to be done to return the safety to the experiment, right? Except in the event that the physician is also going to be one of the subjects. It's an interesting side note because these days aren't a whole lot of researchers or physicians or whoever who are willing to experiment on themselves with something that is brand new. But there was this one guy who had developed a theory of why people were getting stomach ulcers, and nobody wanted to go through his theory. There were a bunch of people who were against him for a lot of different reasons. There were people who were very set on the treatment that was standard at the time. So what this guy did was he gave himself an ulcer, and he ended up winning a Nobel Peace Prize for his work by experimenting on himself. That's one of the few modern cases of this happening. So obviously the idea is that you go into an experiment expecting that you're going to do everything possible to make sure that there is no harm done to your subjects. A priori means that you know about it beforehand. So if you know beforehand that this is going to cause a problem, you should not do it unless you happen to be that doctor who thinks that you're going to find out something exceptional and you're so very sure about it that you're willing to do the experiment on yourself because you believe in it so heavily. That's the idea behind that one. Back in World War II, there were no precautions worried about. Nobody cared whether or not their experiments were going to hurt the subjects most of the time. I don't know, maybe there was somebody who cared, but overall, nobody cared. Some of these things were done specifically to hurt the subjects. And obviously, most of these people who were involved in the experimentation did not care at all whether or not they were well-known problems before the experiment. They didn't care whether they were going to hurt the people or not. They didn't care if there was already a well-known problem that was going to be a further problem that was going to maim or otherwise injure these people. And this is how we essentially ended up with the pretrial process. So you get through the pretrial process where you find out whether or not these things are very likely to have any further effect. And that's why you have the early trial processes on small groups, so that you find out whether these things are going to have an effect on biological material once you get to human trials, if it's going to have the effect on humans that maybe you didn't expect. And that is where you have to say, oh, well, maybe not here. But let's say you go from pretrial stuff and you say, oh, well, like thalidomide, for example. This was not good at what it did, but let's say it killed the rats. Let's say it killed all of the rats in an experiment over the course of 3 generations or something. In the event that all of your pretrial subjects got killed, if something came up in your petri dish while you're doing your pretrial experiments, you have to stop it there, because you can't bring that forward. It's a priori reason to believe that there's going to be serious detrimental effect. Unless you want to do it on yourself. In that case, you believe in it that much, I guess you can. That's why the pretrial process exists. And when you rush these things, when you go fast through all of these trials, when you go through the phases so quickly that you can't actually see what comes up, this is why we had to have very specific workarounds put in place, so that people who were very sick in the 90s, for example, were able to get experimental treatments, because we didn't want people to have experimental medications that we did not know enough about. But when you rush through things, when you don't do the proper set of steps in order to get the information that you need, your emergency situations, your whatever that makes you rush through the process, that's where things happen. And you don't want to be in that position to see what happens after you've decided to rush through things. You don't want to rush the trial process because you don't want to miss the a priori reason that you shouldn't have gone forward. This is why the trial process is long. This is why it's so lengthy, so that you can catch these things, so that they don't move forward. I guess if you don't know about it, it's not a priori, but it's one of those things where maybe it should have been, and maybe you should have caught it, and maybe if it wasn't an emergency situation, and maybe if it wasn't something where you decided that it needed to be rushed, you could have been in a better standing with that, but that's another day. Declaration 3 states that the experiment should be so designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of natural history of the disease or other problem under study that the anticipated results justify the performance of the experiment. This is where, again, your pre-trial process comes in, your pre-human trial process anyway. So you go in and you try to find the mechanism that you're trying to figure out. So if you're trying to cure the common cold, well, that's a good one. There's a lot of previous information about it. You know the basic cycle of it. You know the basic symptoms of it. You know some things that help and some things that don't. You can discern a lot of information based on what you already know. We learned a little bit about this in the discussion of the clinical trial process. You should have a pre-trial experimental phase where you prove that your human trials are worthwhile in doing. You prove that whatever it is that you're trying to cure, whatever it is that you're trying to prove, is worth going into human experimentation. Your pre-trial process exists, like we discussed in the clinical trial discussion, to ensure that what it is that you're trying to study is fit for human trials. And to a certain degree, like it states here, you want to be assured that it's something that needs to be studied, because if you're looking for something that completely cures a cough entirely so that no one ever coughs again, that may not be worth doing. because sometimes a cough is just a cough, and sometimes a cough is a necessary thing for your body to function properly. So human trials need to be based on work that has been done on laboratory animals or through laboratory experimentation. What you need to prove in these pretrial phases is that what you are doing to humans is worth doing. You need to know as much as you can about what's being studied so that you are knowing what you're studying. You need to have the natural history, hopefully, so that you can have an idea of how this thing that you're studying progresses without intervention. And you also need to have your animal studies to see how your experimental thing is going to interact with a mammal, with a biological subject, before it hits a human. It may not directly correlate to humans, but it's close enough that it provides some insight, which is exactly why we experiment on animals first. You need to have a good reason to do the experiment, because why would you do it otherwise? I'll tell you why you may have done it in World War II. In World War II, you may have done it just to see what would happen. There was an awful lot of that going on. There was an awful lot of experimentation that happened just to see what would happen. It's not moral, it's not ethical, but it happened. And it happened frequently enough that it was something notable. Again, if you skip stages, if you shorten stages, if you rush through things, what you miss is longer-term effects. And you might miss those in animals. You might miss those in the early human stages. You might miss them in the laboratory if you haven't done proper previous pre-trial experimentation. You can't rush these things. And you certainly need to know what you're doing beforehand, because you need to know if it's worth it. Declaration 10 states that during the course of the experiment, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage if he has probable cause to believe, in exercise of the good faith, superior skill, and careful judgment required of him, that a continuation of the experiment is likely to result in injury, disability, or death of the experimental subject. Similarly to Declaration 10 is Declaration 9, which states, during the course of the experiment, the human subject should be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end if he has reached the physical or mental state where the continuation of the experiment seems to him to be impossible. The first one states that the person in charge of doing the experiment needs to kind of get over his ego if he has it and stop an experiment that is not going well, that proves to be dangerous at any point pre-trial to phase 4. At any point, if it comes up that that is not something that should be continued, he needs to stop it. As it states, because of his exercise of good faith, superior skill, and careful judgment, which is required of him. So you assume that people who are doing these experiments are hopefully halfway moral people, right? And then Declaration 9, of course, states that the person, the experimental subject who is involved, must be given, similarly, the right to walk away at any point if he believes that he no longer can participate. Which, yeah, it all seems fairly obvious, but it wasn't, and it isn't always. So it's necessary to say it, and it's necessary to have it out somewhere. In World War II, nobody had an out, and often the people who were doing the experiments did not care what was happening to the subjects. They did not care if their experiment was fruitless. They did not have one little bit of mercy or consideration in many cases. Not all cases, but many cases. And, of course, the subjects could never just walk away. No, not during World War II. But we're going to see very shortly that assuming that a person is not coerced or otherwise forced into a position of being an experimental subject, that he should have the right to walk away, because if it's something that he's no longer comfortable with, if it's something that he doesn't want to do anymore, that's a good enough reason. Otherwise, you're essentially a captive. I find Declaration 10 to be really interesting because of how much faith it puts into the experimenter and how much respect it gives him for being a moral person, for being an ethical person, for having the status of being ethical. It's something that hopefully we've come to expect, but it's not necessarily something that we see. I think this one, more than most of these, is maybe something that's a lot more questionable in a modern sense, because there are a lot of people who maybe are involved in things that would not stop an experiment, would not stop something that they're doing if they knew it wasn't going well, because they have financial things that are pushing them in a direction that maybe they should not be going, or they simply have an ego that they don't want to give up. In a sense, the 10th one, the last one, is just as important as the first one. It kind of goes full circle. It goes from the full rights, we'll see in a minute, of the subject down to the full respect and expectation of the person who's doing the experiment. And that's what I think is so interesting about Declaration 10, is that it does give that respect, but only if the researcher does the right thing. I have this much wider idea that applies well outside of the clinical trial thing, well outside of medicine, well outside of scientists. More of a humanity thing, I think. Overall, it seems to be, at least in Western societies, maybe not so much elsewhere, but particularly in Western societies, we seem to be downplaying the importance of morality and character. Character and morality were things that were very important to older cultures. Well, older versions of our culture anyway. And it's the sort of thing that, for reasons that I'm still kind of trying to parse through, and I think I'm going to talk about eventually, we seem to have gotten away from a lot. And it's very unfortunate to me, but it's very interesting that that's going to be the one that ends the Nuremberg Code, the one that I think is of as much importance as making sure that your human subject is well taken care of, is to ensure that the person who's doing the experiment has character and morality enough to do the right thing when it's needed to be done, from pre-trial to phase 4 and whatever after that. Declaration 6 states that the degree of risk to be taken should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment. Declaration 2 states that the experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society, unprocurable by other means or methods of study, and not random and unnecessary in nature. Declaration 6 and 2 basically are talking about your risk-benefit analysis, and Declaration 2 specifically does state that if there are other methods out there that produce less risk, that those should be preferred, because they should not be doing things that are risky for no reason, right? During World War II, there were a lot of experiments that were done just to see what would happen. I talked about this earlier. And obviously those are not appropriate to be done. Almost none of the experiments were done, mostly because of the very poor design of the experiments. None of them were done in a way that would have actually been useful to society. None of this was done for any good cause, which is a good reason that none of it should have been done in the first place. If your risk outweighs the benefit of doing the experiment, then you can't do the experiment. It's not ethical to do the experiment if it's more risky than what you would derive from it. Again, it seems obvious, but it's not always so obvious. Do you remember a few years ago when there was that big Ebola thing? And Ebola is actually terrifying because it will kill, it evens out to be about 50% of the people who it infects. And that is horrifying. There, as far as I know, is no cure for it. All you can kind of do is treat the symptoms, and it's a nasty, nasty illness. So let's pretend that we have a treatment that cures Ebola, like that. Real good treatment, right? The only problem is 30% of the time, high percentage, right? It's going to blind the person who takes the cure. Your risk benefit there is probably a good risk for the benefit that's going to be derived from the use of the medication, from the use of the treatment. However, if you take that same risk, if you take that same cure and you apply it to the common cold, which Yes, the common cold can lead to further infections or greater infections that can eventually become very dangerous, but the common cold itself is not nearly as deadly as Ebola, let's just say. If you take that same treatment that had a 30% chance of blinding somebody and you applied it and say that it cured the common cold, that is probably a risk that is not worth the benefit that would be derived from that particular treatment. If it was maybe a less severe or a less common outcome, maybe that would tweak the risk benefit, and maybe the benefit would become more acceptable for the risk. The common cold is simply less likely to have long-lasting and devastating effects than Ebola does. Yeah, so having something that has such a devastating effect as a treatment is not appropriate, and it's not a good risk. Like it states, if there are other treatments, if there are other remedies that have less risk or they have more history of being effective and your benefit is not significantly more than that, then the previous treatment is the one that should be favored, and your experiment, therefore, is no longer worthwhile or necessary to perform for this, at very most, equal, but probably not as useful or as safe, effective method. That's going to lead us to declaration number 1. Like I said, this is the first one. It is arguably the most important, and it is lengthy. So let's read it. Declaration 1 states that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice, without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior forms of constraint or coercion. Remember that one? And should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. The latter element requires that before the acceptance of an affirmative decision by the experimental subject, there should be made known to him the nature, the duration, purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which it is to be conducted, all inconveniences and hazards reasonably to be expected, and the effects upon his health or person which may possibly come from his participation in the experiment. The duty and responsibility for ascertaining the quality of the consent rests upon each individual who initiates, directs, or engages in the experiment. It is the personal duty and responsibility which may not be delegated to another with impunity. We talked about this. A subject should never not have a way to get out. They should never be forced into doing something. They should always have every piece of information that they can about what is being done. They should know about the possible bad reactions. They should know about every bad thing that could potentially happen as long as it is known. They should know about what they are putting into their body. They need to have as much information as can possibly be given to them. And they always, always need to have a choice. What this is essentially mandatory informed consent. It is the right to control one's own body. Yours and yours alone. Again, in World War II, obviously this was not something that was respected. And on top of that, you had a whole lot of people who were trying to shirk their responsibilities, shirk their participation, shirk their humanity. Because they knew it was wrong. Or maybe they didn't want to admit it. But it doesn't matter. Because ultimately it is wrong. And we know it's wrong. And because it's wrong to coerce people, it is wrong to not tell people everything that they need to know. It is wrong to do things to people that you know are harmful. It is wrong to not give people as much information as they need to make informed decisions. Again, it's a modern sensibility, I guess, but it's also somewhat common sense. We talked about this with, oh, my dear Bill de Blasio. We discussed most of this in the clinical trial process and also in what happened to the people who were affected by thalidomide. This is so essential to human experimentation, to human medicine. It is something that cannot be ignored because they're humans. You're human. They're human. I mean, ultimately, you're looking at the golden rule, right? Don't do something to somebody that you wouldn't do to yourself. If you would not want to be a member of this experiment, if you would not want to be lied to, if you would not want to have information withheld from you, then don't do it to other people. I think we'd all like to think that these things are obvious and that you know that you wouldn't do these things to other people, and it's obvious that no one should do these things to other people, but it's like I said in Declaration 10, there are certain aspects, there are certain elements of morality and character that I have question about in the modern world. I wonder how strong these traits are and how able they are to guide us if we are so lacking in them. And I don't know the answer. I hope we get better at that. I want to discuss these matters so that we can get better at that, at least to the degree that I am able to have any sort of an input into this. But I find it to be vitally important that we discuss what is moral and what gives a person character, because those are the traits I think that are most important in preventing these things from happening in the future. So like I said, a lot of these things are very clearly seen in later implementations of these ideas. In the Kefauver-Harris Act, you saw a lot of these things put into effect so that experimental subjects were legally well protected. The problem with the actual Nuremberg Code is it's not a legal document. These matters had to be implemented into other laws, or in certain cases they were simply seen as a matter of ethics that most people were able to adopt, or had already adopted, but hey, at least it's written down somewhere, right? We would see them again, as I said, in the Kefauver-Harris Act. We would see them also in the 1964 Declaration of Helsinki. We would see them in the Common Rule in the United States. All of these came together to build an interest in what was going to be the human rights of a patient. You know, these are human rights generally, I think we can agree. But specifically as a patient, there are certain things that need to be respected, right? A lot throughout this, I've been saying that it seems obvious in a modern sense, but the thing is, when these declarations were stated, there was a lot of pushback on it. There were a certain number of doctors who said, well, I already took the Hippocratic Oath. I already said that I'm not going to do any harm to my patient. This is stupid. There were a lot of people who said that the language and the expectation was actually too high or too hard or too heavy, and it was unrealistic. But then thalidomide happened, and it became a lot more realistic and a lot more implementable. It became fairly obvious after thalidomide how easy it was to turn back to carelessness and unscrupulousness and bad habits that could lead to things that truly resembled absolute atrocities that happened during World War II that were performed by Nazis. And it became pretty obvious why it was important. Now, I've said this a couple of times again. I'm not convinced that as things stand now that we uphold these standards as well as necessarily we should, but we're certainly better than we were when they were put to paper. And I'm glad that we're much better than we were. But the nice thing about humanity is even if you're exceptional at something, you can always go a little higher. And we should expect a little better. We should expect that our rights as a patient, our rights as people, are to be taken seriously. And They should not be infringed on for any emergency or any reason. I like giving historical context for these things. I like talking about why things are important because it puts many things into context for many people. It allows for an understanding of things that are happening. And in my experience, not a lot of attention has been paid to the past, especially recently. And there's a lot to be known about things that have happened in the past because, yeah, it's the old silly thing about, oh, those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. Kinda not. The thing is, if you don't learn from other people, if you don't learn from the things that have been done before you, you take the past as a gift. You take it as something that is given to you so that you are able to make a better person of yourself, that you are able to be more moral, that you are able to do better things and come to better outcomes and build yourself better than maybe you would have been if you did not learn these things. And that is the importance of learning history and historical facts and things that have happened before. Unfortunately, it's something that in my experience, like I said, is not being given care lately. And I find that to be somewhat depressing. So as much as possible, as much as I can, I'm going to keep talking about things that are meaningful and useful and help to understand the world. Thank you for learning about all of this with me. I might do a little something extra over on Rumble just to sum it up, but we've had a pretty good run through these videos, and I'm so glad that you've decided to come along and hear about them. I think next I really would like to go into more depth on this whole idea of character and morality. So stick around. I'll see you next time. Mostly... Shut up, bird. Stop! Do you have to be right outside my window, honestly? Whatever, you're gonna hear birds.